Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it's been a kind of tough week. One of my good friends and work pals got diagnosed out of the blue with a cancerous brain tumor, and he's getting surgery in the next day or two, depending on how his second opinion consultation this morning goes. We don't go way back. We met in 2015 because we run adjacent trade associations, and but he's really become one of my closest friends over the years, through work and then through everything else we have in common and the interest he has in the rest of my life, and just all the stories that friends share. Like I say, the diagnosis came out of the blue. We talked Monday last week, and everything was cool. And then Wednesday night, his wife texted, and bam, this is what was going on. We got to talk on Friday last week and got into our respective experiences with cancer and mortality and such. And, back when I got diagnosed in the middle of 21 with CLL, my pal and I kind of promised each other that if one of us got incapacitated, the other one would step in to help with their trade group and, do whatever we can for the other's association. The thing is, he's also more than 20 years older than me, and, I realize now that may not have been the best bet on my part. At the time, I seemed like the one who was going into bad health, but as it turns out, I got the best bad news, as I've gone on about endlessly. And we joked about that when we talked on Friday. I was hoping that the tumor made him forget about our pledge, but we'll be there. I'll be there for him. He would be there for me. He won't know what survival prospects look like until they get it out and do the testing and all that. And wouldn't even talk about his prospects for actually going under the knife this week. Now we both cried a few times. He's dealing with a lot of stuff right now with this and getting through everything with his family and well, all I did was promise that if he's around and able to travel, we'll go to a Yankees game together this summer. But that's been rough. Just seeing a friend get struck down like this so suddenly. As a way of coping or otherwise, punishing myself, I spent hours on Saturday rearranging my office library setup down here, moving desks and equipment all over the place till I found a configuration that frees up some floor space, gets more light from one of the windows down here, and just has me feeling like I'm in a different place, a new place. Even though this is the house I've occupied for most of my 52 years. My Eames chair's in a happier place, even if I'm, somewhat unsettled, I guess. But the great rearrangement also got me to throw out a lot of stuff and clean out some old furniture. It's been taking up space and otherwise, reclaim the library from the forces of entropy. So that's good. I came across tons and tons of notepad sheets from the negotiations where I first met my pal back in 2015 and 16. I've been keeping all those sort of in a stack in a place where I should have actually filed them away. So, but it was good cleaning that stuff up and finding a place for everything and getting these recollections of how we first connected. And I guess that's everything. I mean, the upshot was after doing all that moving on Saturday, my back was still good enough to take a 7-mile hike with another of my 70-plus-year-old pals on Sunday. And well, that's pretty much everything. It's all the Gil and his angst report. I apologize for dragging this stuff out. Let's get to this week's show, because you're going to love this one. Because my guest this time is Matt Ruff, who's been on a few times before. This time he is on to talk about his absolute blast of a new novel, which is out today, February 21st, 2023, which is also my dad's birthday. It's called The Destroyer of Worlds, A Return to Lovecraft Country, and it's published by Harper. Now, Matt is one of my favorite living fiction writers, and this book just solidifies my opinion and keeps it going. As a subtitle says, The Destroyer of Worlds is a sequel to Matt's 2016 novel, Lovecraft Country, which if you have not read it, go read it. It is so good. That book was, to simplify things, about an extended African-American family in mid-1950s Chicago and their encounters with the supernatural. But again, that's a very simplistic way of describing it. I could go so long about the awesomeness of Lovecraft Country, the variety of supernatural and SF and horror genres that Matt evokes, the tensions and dynamics of within the family, and the real horror of the racism that they face on a daily basis, all wedded in this perfectly engineered plot that, well, it would take up a whole episode, and did back in 2016 or 17. So this time around, Matt brings us a few years into their future, 1957 to be exact, as the characters we knew from the first book deal with the fallout of what they went through, and the knowledge that they live in a bigger world with haunted houses and interplanetary travel and shape-shifting potions and more, and that the darker forces of that world now know all about them, and they get, well, I talk about it with Matt during the episode, but what most amazed me about this novel was how he managed to bring the characters forward while respecting what made the first novel so special, but without any tinge of fan service. There was no greatest hits, but you felt like you were in their world again, and that their world had changed because they had changed within it. And once again, the plot, as in all of Matt's books, it works like a perfect machine. And Matt's prose, as I've described in our past episodes, absolutely propulsive. The last time we talked was early on in the pandemic, and it was for his novel 88 Names. And we were all going through our mental issues in those early months. And I couldn't finish a book at all during that time. And then I just, let me just pick up Matt's new one. And within about 4 hours, I was just, I'd already finished the thing and was just ready to reread. You will not want to put this book down once you get started. Now, as far as, well, I've only read Lovecraft Country once, but the characters, they return so vividly in my memory, and Matt does such a masterful job of reminding the reader, who they are and what happened the first time around, that I'm pretty sure you could enjoy this even just as a standalone novel, but you really should go read Lovecraft Country. It's so good. But really, I know I talk about the plots and the prose and all that, but the dialogue and interplay of the lead characters, that stuff is worth the price of admission by itself. As we'll talk about, there are quiet moments of conversation that are just absolutely gorgeous and help show how these characters grow and struggle within their world, even with the again, larger forces, demonic plot, and everything else that they're engaged in. They're people, and Matt never lets us forget that. I don't want to go too much into aforementioned demonic plots or anything, except to say that some of the ghosts and nemesis of Lovecraft Country are back, and the characters are, surprise, because it's 1957, still dealing with the racism in America. Also, my favorite part of the first novel gets a significant flex this time around, so I was happy about that. So do yourself a favor, go get The Destroyer of Worlds, A Return to Lovecraft Country, out now from Harper. Oh, also, in the interim from when we last recorded, HBO aired one season of an adaptation of Lovecraft Country, but opted not to renew it. That show went in different directions than Matt's book, and we talked some about the overall experience, but also the experience of seeing his premise adapted and reinterpreted with another creative vision. And he wasn't, particularly involved in the writing or production of the show. And his perspective on all of it is, it's pretty healthy, in my opinion. Anyway, go get The Destroyer of Worlds. And if you haven't read it yet, Lovecraft Country. In fact, do yourself a favor, get Matt's other novels. You're in for a treat. If he's somebody you haven't read yet, you'll thank me afterwards. Anyway, here's Matt's incredibly concise bio from the book. There was a longer one at his site, bymattruff.com. Matt Ruff is the author of the novels Lovecraft Country, The Mirage, Bad Monkeys, Set This House in Order, Fool on the Hill, and Sewer, Gas, and Electric, the Public Works trilogy. He lives in Seattle, Washington. And now, the 2023 Virtual Memories conversation with Matt Ruff. Congratulations. This Destroyer of Worlds, it was an absolute wonder. When you hear the introduction that I'm going to do for this book, you'll blush, I'm sure. But, what struck me, though, your first sequel?
Yeah. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, up to now, my feeling about sequels has always been that it has to be more than just the further adventures of those characters you liked. You've got to have something else to say. The sequels that I've tended to like is where somebody took some aspect of the story and did something really new with it, or had some new statement to make. And just generally in the past, I have felt that, with books, I understand I still get people asking, are you ever going to write a sequel to Fool on the Hill because they really write that novel? And it's like, no, I really said everything I had to say with those characters. And likewise with The Mirage, I made the statement that I felt I was trying to make with that book. But Lovecraft Country was different for a couple of reasons. First, because there was just a lot more that I thought I could do with the characters than I could ever fit in one book. Mm-hmm. And then two, that it had originally started out as an idea for, I'd originally pitched it as a TV series and reimagined it as a book when I couldn't get anybody to bite on that. And part of my solution, I think we may have talked about this before, part of my solution for taking what was an idea for a TV series, an X-Files type, episodic story was to basically make the book almost like a season of television in literary form. So each chapter is an episode, and at first it looks like it's a collection of loosely linked short stories. And then as you go along, you start to realize, well, actually they're all part of a larger arc story. And so it's like a season of TV that you binge read instead of binge watching. And that raised the question early on when I was first talking to my agent about it. Well, do we pitch this as just one season, one book, or do we pitch a whole series? And, for a variety of reasons, the economics on multi-book deals is just not great. And then two, my agent knows me, and she was like, well, are you sure you're not going to get bored? You're going to write one book and feel you've got everything, and then you're committed to this multi-book deal. And then, of course, too, there's the problem. What if we have no idea, is the book going to do well? Sure. So basically the compromise was write one book, write it as if the only one you're going to get. And then if you later feel like you want to go back and do more, we can always have that conversation then. So that was what I did. And by the time I had finished writing Lovecraft Country, the idea of carrying the story onward had not gone away. It had gotten stronger. But I did still have this problem where I did have this idea that if Lovecraft Country standing alone works well. It ends on a somewhat open-ended note because again, the characters, they've won a victory, but they're still going to wake up black in America in the 1950s. So it's not like I can just have them live happily ever after. Right. So it seemed better to have it end that way and just say, yes, they're still going to face new challenges tomorrow, but now that they have the smarts and the courage to face whatever comes. And that's a good place to end if you're going to end the story there. But there was this other larger story I had in mind that would carry the story forward all the way to the mid-1960s when the Civil Rights Act is passed and when the Safe Negro Travel Guide, which is my fictional version of the Green Book, could cease publication, which is, that was the dream of a lot of folks who had created systems for navigating the world of legal segregation. They wanted nothing more than to be able to go out of business and just become full American citizens who didn't need to, have these special tools for dealing with daily, racism. Yeah. So that seemed like I had an idea for a longer version of the story that would carry it to there, but I still ended up with this problem that if I, one book, okay, but if I go back, then I'm going to want to tell the whole story. And that's still going to take me at least 2 and possibly 3 more books. So,
you remember what happened to Robert Caro? He started with 3 books on Lyndon Johnson and he's up to 5. So,
Yeah. So in interviews that I gave after Lovecraft Country came out, this question would come up, are there going to be sequels? And I would sort of hem and haw and say, well, I'm thinking about it, but it basically, I would give this answer where it's a big commitment if I go back, and I'm not sure, what my publisher is going to think about that. And I do write rather slowly and deliberately. And so, if I think 3 books, if I take my usual pace of, 3 or 4 years a book, that's like a decade to finish that. I much as I admire George R.R. Martin's bank account, I don't think I would want to be in his situation where people are waiting, half a lifetime for him to finish the series. So, but it just, the idea, I kept answering that way rather than just saying no, which is, if, I know myself well enough, when I keep talking about it, it means, yes, I want to do this. I've just got to figure out how. And basically the TV series is what made that possible. Mm-hmm. When the HBO series came out, the book became a New York Times bestseller for, I think it was 10 or 11 weeks running. And at that point, I was basically, okay, Harper will say yes, at least to one more book if I ask them. So it's just basically, do you want to do this? And if you do, this is the time. It's either going to be now or never. And so I decided, I want to do this. I want to try. Let me go back. And so that's how I got here. And so far, so good. I'm really happy with the early reception of the novel. And for people who, are wondering about this, I did write it. I did try to write it as a standalone where it will tell you what you need to know. If you haven't read Lovecraft Country, you can just read this book, and it does resolve all of the immediate crises it raises, although it's clearly, in this case, I definitely do intend to write more. But yes, it is meant to be part of a larger series that will take at least 1 more and possibly 2 more books to finish. So,
yeah, I hadn't read Lovecraft Country since we first met back in 2017. And I was like, I should go back. I've just got a lot of other things going on. And when I started Destroyer, I realized, no, he is perfectly, all the little hints you need as to what happened the previous time and memory of that stuff. It all comes back right away. So I think, and my wife said the same thing. I want to read the book again before going to this one. I'm like, you don't have to. You'll be familiar enough with the characters and the scenarios. There's enough, background to really get it across standalone, but also really inform that first experience with the book. So, but, it struck me when you talk about, the reason for doing sequels, what really grabbed me about this was it doesn't have the fan service thing that sort of characterizes so much of the, kind of IP driven sequels and all the various TV and movie experiments we see over the years. The characters are all there, but they all grow. Like you move them forward. You showed what life was like for them after this and after the first book. And it was really amazing to see. a book like this that, takes such care and deliberation while at the same time being so absolutely propulsive, which is that term I always use for your prose. Because it was the same thing. I sat down, I'm like, well, let me just start this. And, I look back up and 75 pages are done. I'm like, oh, I feel bad for Matt now because I'm reading a book that I know he labored over. I'm just devouring it in one sitting. But
no, I'm very good with that. And it's funny that, I mean, this is the thing I sometimes feel bad about when I'm, because of course, as a writer, you're often, one of the questions that always comes up when you're interviewed is like, oh, what are you reading now? And I have to say there's a sense in which, streaming movies and TV series has sort of taken a lot of the space that I used to devote to novel reading, just because, I mean, I've always written in a somewhat cinematic style, and that has grown rather than receding as I've gotten older. I just love that, that kind of storytelling. And so, yeah, that propulsiveness is partly just it's a sign of what kinds of stuff I'm watching, basically, that I love a story that just sort of grabs you and pulls you along and moves very quickly. That's always been a part of my style, but it's partly just influenced by the fact that, I'm just watching a lot of TV and a lot of movies. So
when we get to the end, I'll ask what you're watching instead of what you're reading. So we'll work on that. But it was the same thing at the beginning of the pandemic when you and I recorded around 88 Names. Like, I was mentally fried around a couple of books I was trying to work through. And like, hey, let me just start Matt's book. And all of a sudden, 250 pages later, I'm like, well, that's opened up now. I can go back to reading because Matt dragged me into a plot and zoomed me through this book. So
I'm very glad to hear that that's how it works for you, because that's good. That's what I want.
Yeah. But tell me with this one, as you mentioned, Lovecraft Country was constructed in, essentially episode chapters. And this one has the more interwoven structure where you're not, having those sort of standalones. How different writing process or plotting process was that for you, given that those characters were so known from that episodic structure the first time around?
Yeah, this was actually something that hindered me early on when I was trying to figure out, because I had initially assumed that, of course, I had to stick to the same structure as the first novel. Yeah. And that was really kind of getting in my way, because it makes sense in the first book in particular, because each chapter is not just telling part of the story, it's introducing you to each of the characters. Like everybody, there's seven named protagonists, and they've each got basically a chapter that is theirs. So, the first one is essentially, I always thought of as Atticus's story. Granted, it introduces the world as well. And then, and the second one is obviously the Tisches with the haunted house and so on. And having introduced the characters, I found that, now I wanted to do a more conventional narrative structure, and I wanted to be able to jump back and forth between storylines rather than being locked into one character or one group of characters' perspectives for an entire 10,000 word span. And for a long time, it was just like, well, how am I going to make this work? And it was my friend Christopher Moore, the novelist Christopher Moore. We were talking, whenever he and I are in the same city together, we'll get together and just sit and talk shop. And I was talking to him about this and saying, this is really kind of kicking my ass that I can't make this older structure work as well with the story I want to tell. And he was basically like, Matt, what are you talking about? You don't have to keep the same structure that's not working. You can do it any way you want, which is one of those obvious things in hindsight, but I just needed to hear it from somebody else.
When you're inside the silo, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
So for me, it was, now that we know who these characters are, a more conventional narrative structure where I can jump back and forth between threaded storylines just worked better. And as soon as I got through that, I was like, oh yeah, of course, I'll do it that way. That just seemed to fit better. And I think that going forward, I will probably stick to that. Just because it works better now that we know who the characters are. There's no need to lock into that episodic thing. And it also does mark a break between, I think when this is all said and done, it will basically feel like Lovecraft Country in a way is set apart slightly from this continuation where they're all of a piece, but there will still be a feeling where, yes, the first novel sort of sets the stage, and then there's this larger story that begins from that is, connected to it, but also kind of its own thing. So, just, I mean, I don't know if you experience it that way, but in my own head, I think I'm kind of thinking of it that way, partly because there was this long gap where I wasn't sure whether there was going to be any more.
Yeah. How long was that period for you? Was it around the time, like you said, that the HBO series came out that you dived into starting this? That the HBO series, spurred on the sales of the original book it's funny. After I finished Lovecraft Country and when I was thinking about what I was going to do next, I did write the first couple chapters of Destroyer of Worlds just because I wanted to see, first of all, whether it would feel right, and it did. And so I kind of asked my editor at Harper about this and said, I'm thinking about doing a sequel to Lovecraft Country. What do you think? And they were polite, but it was basically at that point, it was before, I don't know if it was before the HBO deal had happened or if it was just when that was starting. And basically the feeling was, this is not quite the right time. You should do something else first. And so I was like, okay, I will go and do 88 Names, which was the other idea I had. And then, but again, by the time that was done, I was still thinking about continuing it. And so I would say the gap was probably from about 2017 to about 2020. And then at that point and then just to really hedge my bets going back, I didn't just go back and say, really, I want to do a sequel. I basically went back to what I had written and I continued it and wrote basically the first half of Destroyer of Worlds that it's broken into 3 sections. I wrote all of the first section and enough of the second section so that you got a sense of what all of the different characters were doing, because of course the first third of the book is basically going back and forth between Atticus and Montrose's journey to North Carolina and Letitia and Hippolyta and Horace's journey to Las Vegas. And then we go back to Chicago and see what George and Ruby are up to. So I wrote enough that you had a sense about what everyone was doing and then a description of where I was going to go. And that was what I took to Harper. And I said, see, really, I tend to do this where I really need to prove and give them a good sense of what I have in mind and that it can work. And at that point they were like, sure, you clearly are committed to this. We'll do it. And so the question is,
yeah, I guess that was, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the question, and this gets beyond the practical writing into the heavy duty stuff. Racism and its response in America really evolved rapidly in that little span that you just mentioned, that 2017 to 2020-ish range. How did that affect your writing of black characters in the 1950s?
I have to say, not really at all. Yeah. I mean,
there's nothing in there.
Always been a thing.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, this has always been. I mean, this comes up a lot, like when Lovecraft Country came out, and then again when the HBO series was released, and people would talk to me about how timely it was, and I had to point out that, these things about police killings of black folks and other things like that, it's kind of an evergreen topic, unfortunately. Yeah. And I mean, one thing that doing the research for the book is kind of reassured me is that things really are dramatically better than they were in the 1950s. The fact that just the response to this stuff and the degree to which people, at least in feel like they have to say something, it definitely is a total sea change. And I would not give anything to go back to the bad old days of the 1950s. So things have improved enormously, but it's precisely because they have improved enormously. But stuff like the killing of Tyre Nichols still happened that, just people are really annoyed that why can't we just get rid of all of it? Yeah. And, but it's just it is a sign of how much things have shifted and how much more power in society African Americans have, that these things still become very big issues, and a lot is made of them, because whereas in the past stuff like that would just get swept under the rug and you wouldn't necessarily hear about, awful things would happen, and there might be one or two that would make the news, but there would just be so many awful things that just never even got reported. And so, but yeah, in terms of the writing process, no, I don't really. Yeah,
because it doesn't feel like you're foreshadowing or hinting that, a different world is coming, that, there's still the characters are living in the time they're living in.
I mean, that's the thing. I try to keep my own way of thinking about stuff separate from the way the characters are thinking about it. And because it's not about me, it's about, I want to do psychologically realistic portraits of these folks living in a time before I was born. And that means just not letting my own present day thoughts impinge on it too much. And the other thing too, is that the way I'm thinking, today in 2023 is going to be different than the way I'm thinking in 2027. I'm still changing my mind about all kinds of things, but I want the book to be more consistent in its own, the books to be consistent in the vision of what's going on there. So it's really, when I'm there, I'm writing very, very much in the spirit of the characters, and I'm very cold and deliberate. And when I'm thinking about it, I'm not bringing my own passions to bear necessarily. So there's that. And yeah, So I just try not to let current events influence it, because the other thing too is when things that are happening now, I need time to think about them, just to think about what my own attitude is going to be towards them. And I don't want to take that half process thinking into a novel where it doesn't belong in the first place, if that makes sense.
No, there you go. Being all deliberate and thoughtful about writing. That's which I find admirable. Don't get me wrong. So,
I mean, it's like your comment about there's not a sense of fan service, that it's true. I mean, that is the thing too, is that I totally understand the attraction of that, but, and something else I've been thinking about, and this I guess in a longer term, in terms of where I want to go with these novels, one of the things that I'm coming more into is that when I first started writing, I made a point, even when I pitched Lovecraft Country the first time, I made a point of not giving, I didn't give Atticus a white friend for the audience to identify with, because my feeling was always, if you're going to tell the story of, the horrors of Jim Crow, you want to stay focused on the characters for whom it is a horror. And if you need a sort of a good white guy to sort of identify with, or to prove to you that not all white people are bad, then you're not going to get into the story anyway. You're going to bounce off it. So I don't want to waste time on that. But I did also feel that, once the characters are established, the idea of cross-racial friendships and the difficulties of that are an interesting thing to get into. So it's like, I wouldn't give Atticus a white friend because I want to prove that, not all white people are evil, but I would definitely want to explore interracial relationships to show how complicated it can be when, the white party, if they ever get tired of dealing with racism, they can just sort of hang it up and, go back to America and not worry about it, while the black character is still stuck in the wrong side of the color line. So
you've got the scene with the police officer in Nevada that,
right,
builds in a certain direction and veers in another one, that it's just so masterful the way it conveys exactly that, that the black characters are expecting something absolutely different than what ends up transpiring.
Right. And then also the necessity of making alliances, that one of the things I do notice with, more modern takes is that power and revenge fantasies are very popular. And I have no problem with those, but when you look at history, it's like black community needed to make alliances with, white liberals and white activists, just because they needed the numbers. And those strategic alliances, even with people who you necessarily didn't, you might not like them all the time, you might not agree with them all the time, but together they were stronger and able to affect change in a way that just wouldn't be possible with a more purely separatist movement. And that is something else I kind of want to get more into as I go along. And this was also something that I discovered, like researching the Roanoke, the third Roanoke colony that formed the nucleus of the Maroon Society in the Great Dismal Swamp, is that was a multiracial society. They went into the swamp white and black and Indian together, and particularly even in latter days, like the swamp community came to be dominated by escaped slaves. So there were more black people fleeing into the depths of the swamp, but particularly in the southern end of the Great Dismal, where that initial community had been formed, they were described historically as a tawny people, meaning that it wasn't just all black folks hiding out. It was poor whites. It was Native Americans. And that kind of idea of union of oppressed people coming together and pulling together, not in a colorblind society, but in a united front, I think that's something that certainly historically is going to figure more into the story. So going forward, I'm going to get more into interracial friendships and alliances and so on. That's got to be a part of the tale as I go. And that's always kind of been there, even in the first book where, Letitia, she doesn't try to exercise Winthrop's ghost. She basically, she's not like, this is my house now, you have to leave. She's like, no, this is our house now, and you're going to have to learn to put up with me.
Yeah.
Which is also a very Matt Ruff way to approach things. I always
yeah.
I always prefer narratives where there's not the easy out of, we're all going to agree and get along. It's like, no, we're stuck in the car together and we're making this road trip and we're just going to have to learn we can shout at each other, but we're going to have to learn how to get along. So, and that's going to, I think, play a bigger and bigger role as this saga goes forward. So
where'd your interest in, say, race relations? I don't even know what term to apply exactly to it, but do you know where that began for you?
Well, it's not specifically race. It's just different worldviews, really.
Yeah.
The fact that human beings just don't see eye to eye on stuff. And that comes from, my dad was a Lutheran minister from the Midwest, grew up in Michigan and Illinois. Eventually, after the failure of his first marriage, came to New York City to work as a hospital chaplain. My mother was a missionary's daughter. Her father, Albert Landbauer, was a famous missionary from St. Louis, Missouri, who went down to southern Brazil to what they call the Guarani region. And he's famous not so much as a missionary. He's the guy who brought the first soybean plants to Brazil. And there's actually a street named after him in one of the cities down there. And there's a little museum where you can see a bust of his head. I've never been, but this is a thing that he's basically one of the founders of the soybean industry in Brazil. But anyway, he went down there and there was a colony of German and Russian woodworkers in southern Brazil who were nominally Lutheran, but really were unchurched. And so he was sent to reclaim them, to the true faith before the Baptists could get hold of them. So, he couldn't get any of his girlfriends from Missouri to come join him in the jungle. So he ended up marrying one of the Russian emigres there, my grandmother, Helena Preby, and they had 8 kids together. And my mom was born in the jungle, and then eventually they moved across the river into Argentina, and that's where mom grew up in Argentina during the Perón era. And she eventually emigrated to the United States at age 23, and then a few years later met and married my dad. So our house was Ellis Island for all the South American relatives when they emigrated to the U.S. So we were never alone together in the house. It was always, some cousin or aunt, was living with us. And missionaries in particular are very opinionated people. And then at one point, my grandmother eventually came and moved up to us. And by then she had converted to Mormonism. So, which was very much a scandal in the family. I mean, mom didn't care, but a lot of the other relatives did. And so it was very common. The first thing they'd come in the door, put down their suitcases, grab a Bible and, go downstairs to the basement to try and convert grandma. And, this is the environment I grew up in, a very conservative Christian household, very combative, lots of theological debates. And of course, you had the cross-cultural thing between North American and South America. And but then at the same time, I was living in New York City in the immediate aftermath of the civil rights movement. So one of the most liberal and progressive cities in the world. And then I've got this little, conservative Christian theological debate society where I'm growing up. So basically, at an early age, I understood I'm going to be dealing with a lot of people who think differently than me. And again, you can't kill them. You got to find a way to love them and get along with them. And that's why this stuff fascinates me. I love the way fiction lets me play different worldviews off against each other and explore different people's and, different cultures' thoughts from inside their from the inside. Take my outsider perspective, put it inside, and then see what it looks like from that angle. And so that's what draws me to this. And Lovecraft Country is just one iteration of that general idea. It's not just that I'm fascinated by very specific issue of black-white relations in America. That's just one of many possible subjects of interest that I happen to have picked up along the way.
I have to say, as much as I appreciate the, as we've said, propulsiveness of story, prose, etc., my favorite parts of the book are those interlude conversations about exactly this stuff. Well, where the Destroyer of Worlds phrase comes from, the conversation with Horace and his mom earlier in the book. Those moments to me, A, felt utterly human, and B, felt in a sense like you were exploring, not just the characters. And I was telling my wife, I'm like, you're going to love this. You're going to love the rest of the book, but these little moments are the ones that really, tell us so much, I guess, about the world or the ways of seeing the world.
Well, those, yeah, and specifically Horace's conversation with his mother, it was when I imagined that scene, like when I talk about that the sequel's got to be about something more than just the further adventures of these characters, it was when I imagined that conversation that I realized, yeah, this is why I want to write the book, precisely so that I can explore that. And the larger issue of what these next books are about, what I want to do basically is tell Horace's coming of age story, in 2 or 3 parts. This budding young comic book artist who I have very strong affinity for. I remember what it was like to be a young kid. Obviously my art is prose rather than visual, but just that sense of, I remember what it was like to be 12 and you just decide that this is what you want to do with your life. And you assume naively that of course it will work out. And that naive assumption is part of what makes it possible. But at the same time, as an adult, you look back and you're like, wow, what the hell was I thinking? This is not a practical path to walk at all. So I thought it would be really interesting to sort of tell Horace's version of that and both the universal aspects of it, but also the very specific aspects of what it would mean to be a young black man at that time trying to make a go of it. So, and again, if I do what I want and carry the story forward to 1964, Horace will be 22 years old then. So just entering adulthood, ready to go out on his own. And so that to me that's the through line that will help me unite all these other storylines that I want to talk about. And then each of these books will focus on a different aspect of maturity. And so The Destroyer of Worlds is basically about death and mortality and that moment when you realize, yes, I'm going to die one day. And it's not just an abstract concept. And, my parents have told me this, lovely story about how you get to go to heaven when you die and everything's going to work out. And, there will ultimately be justice. The arc of the universe bends towards that. But there's a point where you ask yourself, yeah, what if that isn't true? Yeah. What if this is all we get? And what if people who get cheated or get a bad life, there's no recompense for that. There's no reckoning. And once you ask that question, that's a permanent loss of innocence, because even if you find your way back to some kind of faith is not knowledge. So you're going to be living with this uncertainty over your head for the rest of your life. And if you're a black man in America, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, that's a lot of uncertainty. That's a heavy load to bear. And how do you come to carry that weight? And so thinking about that is like, okay, that's what this book is really about. And obviously there's all the other fun stuff. There's the adventure, the action and stuff. And that part of helps, that helps make it all more interesting. But yes, these moments where we get to slow down a little and talk about these things, that's also for me part of the book, and it's what makes it worth it. Yeah. Because if all I wanted to do was do an action adventure, well, I could just come up with something totally new, and that'd probably be more interesting for me. But this lets me talk more about these characters whose language I already know and whose place in the world I already have a sense of, and that's why I wanted to do it. So,
and just balancing, I don't mean voices as in the characters, but each one is so distinct in how they relate to one another and how they speak. The fact that I burn through these books, fills me with regret, because I'd love to, go back and savor them after and see. But what did you learn from the the experience of seeing the show or the book adapted, the first book adapted into a series at HBO? And did it well, what did you learn? We'll just go with that as a starting point.
The first thing I learned, in which I was very happy, was that, I am not the kind of territorial author who has a problem with, my work being adapted,
Mm-hmm.
And I'd always hoped that would be the case, but you never really know until you see it on the screen.
Sure.
And somebody makes decisions that are different than the ones you'd made. And you're like, some people just can't handle that. And I was very pleased that I was able to watch it on its own terms. And occasionally when something was too close or changed in a way that kind of caught me off guard, I would have to watch an episode twice, maybe once to see what happened, and then a second time to just sort of get it the way I was meant to get it. But in general, there was no point where I felt like, oh, you can't do that, or, oh, you mustn't have done that. It was just interesting seeing.
Was there any, oh, wow, I wish I had done that moment?
No,
Okay,
actually,
okay.
I'm not saying that could never happen, but I feel like Misha Green, the showrunner, has her very own particular sensibility, and it's an interesting one, but it's not mine. And so there wasn't really anything there that I felt like, oh gosh, I missed a trick there. It's like, no, I'm happy with the choices I made, and nothing I see here makes me feel like I overlooked anything. It was more like, yeah. And the other thing was just, it was nice too to see this proof of concept that this story is rich enough to support multiple interpretations, which again, I felt would always to be the case, but it's nice to see evidence of that.
Yeah.
And
it's one thing to think
of course,
that. Go on.
Yeah, this is one of the objections that is sometimes raised by people who feel that, white people shouldn't be writing from a black perspective, or, that sort of thing where people should stay in their own lane, is that if a white author tells this story that is, not their quote unquote, not their story to tell, that they're somehow going to prevent a black writer from telling the story. And it's like, well, no, actually, what this shows to me is that there are as many ways to tell a story as there are authors who want to tell it. And even if by a story you're specifically narrowly referring to, a story of a particular name with a particular plot, particular concept and a particular set of named characters, it's like you could do, there's not just one Lovecraft Country, there's really as many as you want to take the time to tell. And they're all going to have overlap, they're all going to complement each other in some way. But the idea that there's a definitive way to tell it that ends this is used up, we don't want to do any more, it just doesn't seem to be the case. And of course, if you broaden the focus out wider to, stories that combine the supernatural with, a more realistic assessment of history, or, even wider still to stories about the quote unquote black experience, well, that's just such a broad well, the idea that any one book or, even one writer's entire output could meaningfully exhaust the potential there. That's just absurd. Yeah. And so it's nice to see, like, I always knew that this was true, but it's just sort of nice to see evidence of that. And then beyond that, I just learned a lot about just visiting the set a couple of times. I learned a lot about the process of movie making and how different it is from what I do. So that was just sort of fascinating to see, to be a tourist in that world. And man, some of the wildest moments were just when they filmed the block party scene from the first episode of the series. That was a 2-night shoot, and it was all night, and I was there. I got to be there, and there was just this point around midnight of one of the nights when I'm standing in the middle of all this, watching all of this activity. I mean, I don't know how much they spent to dress up these 2 blocks of, Southwest Chicago to look like the 1950s, and then all of the extras and all of the technical people. And it's like, all of this is happening because this weird little story I made up in my room. That is quite an experience. And yeah, it's just, you also really begin to understand too, that one of the nice things about novels is that it's just much easier to take chances and do things on your own, because there's a lot less infrastructure involved. One person can just sit down with a word processor or even just a pen and paper and make up a story. Whereas as soon as you want to do a movie, you're talking a much larger crew of people. It's a team sport, and it very quickly becomes a hugely expensive team sport. There's, so I for someone like me who likes to follow his own head and likes to, push the envelope and do weird, do experiments that other people might not think are worth doing. I'm working in the right medium for that. If I had to do it on film where you've got to convince people ahead of time to spend the money, that's just a much harder road to go down. So,
did it raise any, I don't want to say, well, did it raise any interest for you in terms of pitching TV or movie related projects? Or did you really just come out of it with, that's great, I'm sticking with books. If they decide to option things, they option things?
I think that, yes, there is a part of me now that is, I'm definitely thinking about it in part because one of the things I've come to realize is that the other thing about the other side of that equation, obviously, is Hollywood is where the big money is. Yeah. And, if there is a point where I'm going to, I'm 57 now, so hopefully I've still got a couple of decades of good working life left, but there is going to be a point where I'm going to need to retire. And if you want to be financial stability, you want to be comfortable, then money, the kind of money you can get from TV in Hollywood is certainly much better equipped to that. And there are stories that I come up with that there's not enough there for me to write a whole novel around, I don't think, but that I think could still be good stories. And one of the things about those visual mediums is that I think there are, you can do more with less in a way. You don't have these long internal monologues. You don't have to spend as much time on description. You can just say, this is what it is. And then because it is a team sport, other people will be thinking of what the sets are going to look like. And then of course the actors are going to bring the characters to life, and you can focus on, dialogue has always been a snap for me. So yeah. There's a sense in which I think I would be very good at writing screenplays because those are largely dialogue, and then the description that is in the screenplay is more functional than anything else, and that I'm fine at. I'm good with functional description. Where when I have to describe stuff, more ornately or get into there's just certain things I'm just not that interested in clothing, so I tend to describe clothing very one of my editors was teasing me for using sort of non-descriptive descriptors. Well, I'll describe something wearing a sharp-looking suit, and it's like, well, what does that mean exactly? And I'm like, it just looks good. I don't want to get into. I don't know what kind of cloth or what the cut would be. It's just That's what I mean, and I don't want to waste time talking about that. So, yeah. So there is a thing to be said for you could sort of come up with a cool idea that is mostly dialogue based, and then you got action and stuff, and that the things that I think are my strengths as a writer, and then you can sort of offload the stuff that isn't my strength necessarily. Not to insult any screenwriters listening, but of course there's always that joke about children's books, where people say, "Oh, I should write a children's book. They look so short." It's like, oh yeah, I could bang out a Dr. Seuss book in an afternoon. Yeah, and it's like, yeah, well, everybody thinks that, but only one guy actually made it work. So. But that being said, I think if the elements of screenplay, dialogue, and plotting are certainly strengths of mine, that would be something I could do, and I could do it quickly, and it would be an interesting thing to try. And again, I'm kind of talking out of my butt here because I haven't actually done it yet, but that is something I would at least like to try to my hand at and see if it it will be much harder than I think it is, but it would be nice to know if I can actually pull it off. So,
did you have any involvement with the writers during the show? Was there any sort of either calling you in or just hey, do you want to sit in case something comes up that we need your advice on? I was on call, but they just, they did not need massive input from me. And I was happy to stay out of the way. I mean, again, I got the sense very early on that Misha had her own sense of, what she wanted to do, and she didn't need my help, and I wasn't going to force it on her if she didn't need it. Sure. I gave her a bunch of notes about the characters, like I had worked out, I worked out all the family trees. I mean, this was stuff that had been in my head, but once the series happened, I was like, okay, let me map this out and fill in some gaps and name some characters who didn't have names. That was just that guy's wife and so, and
there's 5 generations here, and I don't know the names of all the characters, so let me just make up some names to sort of fill these gaps in, and maybe, you know, throw out some possibilities for who so-and-so's ancestors were. And then there was another document where I just basically described, I talked about the different magic artifacts and my general thinking on how magic worked in the story and why I made the choices I did. And you know, and it was basically a case of, here are my thoughts, you know, take what you need, and or what looks interesting to you, ignore the rest. And if you have any questions, you know, give me a call. And that, you know, Misha was appreciative of that, but, you know, she had her own thing. And so, yeah, they had their own story, and I'd already told my version of the story, so I didn't feel a need to put my thumb on this other version.
Sure. I was just wondering if it, you know, gave you any sort of in-room experience, just so you could look around and say, oh, that's what it's like to, you know, to actually do this writing, you know, as part of a group. And, you know, yeah. That is
the one thing that, yeah, would have been interesting about that. But again, I just would have felt, you know.
Oh, yeah. No, I get exactly where you're coming from.
Particularly the first time, I just would have, I don't know that it would have been an organic experience anyway. It would be weird to have, it's like having, you know, the teacher looking over your shoulder or something. It just, I was worried what, you know, I didn't want to be in the room and have them feel like they had to worry about what I was going to think, because it didn't matter.
So tell me about pandemic era writing. You know, working on this sort of thing during lockdown, because we spoke early-ish in lockdown, maybe that April or May when 88 Names came out. I guess the over question is, how's your pandemic been? You know, this whole situation as we know it.
I mean, to a degree, it hasn't been that much different than the way my life has always been. I've always been a fairly, you know...
Yeah, every writer and cartoonist tells me the same things.
Yeah, introverted person. So, you know, and I mean, in the early days, I did notice when I would go out for walks that, gosh, it's a lot quieter than usual. There was that period when everyone was seriously locking down and nobody was going to work at, you know, that you would go outside and there was just this weird hush. But then people got tired of that, and the vaccines happened, and you know, there's of course this ongoing debate about, you know, should we still be masking, should we be doing this and stuff. But there's just a point where you human beings just won't, unless there's an immediate threat, unless they're nervous. Just a lot of folks just aren't gonna trouble themselves over that. So life got back to sort of normal, but yeah, for me, it just hasn't been all that different. And because the internet obviously makes a big difference. I think if this had happened 20, 30 years ago, then it would have been a very different experience. It would have felt much more solitary, because back then you really did have to go out to communicate with people, or God forbid, actually pick up a phone, by which I would mean an actual landline and dial and be tethered to this, you know, but now it's like, yeah, I already live so much of my life online that as long as I've got an internet connection, it feels the same. I feel like I have my real friends online, and then also my imaginary friends, people I follow who don't know that I exist, but I feel like they're part of my daily routine. So it's only the main differences have just been that physical book tours were already getting much smaller. I don't think I've been east of the mountains for a book tour since, probably Bad Monkeys. But now it's like, yeah, you particularly during the pandemic, there were no live events. And now that we're having live events again, but for this book, I'm going to be in Seattle. I'm going to go down to Portland, and I'm going to go up to Vancouver, and that's pretty much it. Yeah. And part of that is just that they realized, I mean, this realization was already coming, but that you can reach many people more easily and more effectively and more economically simply by doing things like podcasting and Zoom events and, you know, remote appearances. That will never totally substitute for in-person events. People love to meet you. People love to be able to talk to you personally. But for any but the most best-selling authors, like if you're a Neil Stevenson or a Christopher Moore, then it makes sense to send you still on a 24 city book tour. But for someone like me, even with the moderate success I've had with Lovecraft Country, the idea of, you know, paying a bunch of money to fly me out to New York or Boston or wherever, it's just like, we can just get you on Zoom, you know.
I appreciate it entirely, because trade show travel, I've been very did I really need to do as much as I was doing before? And I pick my spots much better now in this last year or two. I will note you did do some travel. You actually went to the Great Dismal Swamp.
Yes.
In 21, which produced one of the funniest blog posts I've read in a long time. But I'll also point out, when we recorded in 2017, you mentioned you were researching, the history in the Great Dismal Swamp. You didn't mention that it was a Lovecraft sequel. I won't hold that against you, but you could have told me, for Christ's sake.
One of the reasons I didn't mention that was because I although I had in my own head this sort of larval plan to make this work, I still had no idea that, is Harper ever really going to go for this? And I just, there was no point in saying, oh yes, I'm working on a Lovecraft Country sequel, if, I kind of didn't want to jinx it, and I just didn't want to.
That's why I usually never ask that out in the world. I usually never ask what book is next for that same reason. But, I'll say, when you mentioned the descriptors and, building an environment and all that, I did feel those sections in the Great Dismal Swamp, they felt real. And I remembered, I'm like, oh yeah, wait, he wrote that piece about going to visit. I hunted it down before we recorded this so I could refresh. But, tell me about the impetus and what you got out of actually, experiencing the swamp in its, 2021 incarnation, I guess.
Well, one of the reasons I really did feel like I had to go was that I wanted to make sure that this was something I knew I was going to have to describe in detail. And I wanted to make sure that I got it right. And at least enough that I would not be embarrassed if I later found out that, oh, you missed something important. So I thought it was important to go down there and spend at least a few days wandering around, getting a sense of what the experience was like, how it sounded, how it felt, how it smelled. And I am fortunate that my initial plan was to do the crazy thing and go in August. Like, let me go to the swamp in high summer. And eventually I deferred that, which was good because I forget, did I go in September? I think it was either September or October that I went. So it was getting towards fall, but it was still, I would leave the hotel I was staying at was about a couple of, 2-3 miles from the entrance to the swamp area. And this is a wildlife, it's really more of a wetland than a full swamp now, but so it's this, wildlife area that is protected. I mean, they still have logging going on in there, so it's not completely protected, but they do manage it. So you get there and you go in, and there's a long walk until you get to the quote unquote swamp proper. But anyway, I would leave, and when I would leave my hotel early morning and walk out there, it would be 50 degrees, 60 degrees, but it very quickly would rise to the low 80s. And even at that, the humidity was such that I would bring 2 big jugs of water. And I would drink all of it before I was done. And I was walking, I was doing like 25, 30 mile hikes in the swamp every day I was there. And even sticking to the shade, even, staying hydrated, it was like, if it had been 10 degrees hotter, I would have just died out there. I would not have been able to go nearly as far. And even as it was this weird thing where, one of my hands would start to swell up towards the end of the day. It's just like, my feet are a little sore and blistering. And so, and this is going at a time when there are walkable roads where they have, Fish and Wildlife has earth moving equipment that they use to plow these trails and clear them, because if you don't, the vegetation comes back very quickly. So it was very useful to see. As soon as you're in there, you understand immediately why 200 years ago this would have been a great place to escape the long arm of the law, because without earth moving equipment, it really is the kind of terrain where you could spend a day traveling a mile. And if you don't have a machete, I mean, the vegetation is unbelievably dense, and it includes both thorns and poison ivy. And, I'm sure there, it's funny. I didn't think about ticks until it was my last day there, but I was like, at some point I was like, oh yeah, I probably should be worried about ticks, shouldn't I? I hear they're bad.
Yeah. I guess you don't have those in the Northwest. Up here, we got a lot in the Northeast. So, yeah.
That's right. We don't. Yeah. And then, yes. And of course there are various types of venomous snakes and so on. And, so yeah, it is the kind of place where if you know how to get around, it's a great place to disappear. It's also a great place to just get killed if you're not careful. You get bit by something, you get an infection. Of course, this is long before antibiotics. So, and you're talking about people who probably didn't have shoes. They probably had tattered clothes. I mean, the good news is the water, because it's so acidic, is drinkable. I mean, because there's all this dead vegetation, it's not a good environment for bacteria. So you're not going to get, Giardia or other diseases like that. But the swamp has plenty of other ways to kill you if you're not careful.
And you almost got killed by a deer. So,
well, yeah, that was what was funny is, yeah. So I'd leave the hotel right after breakfast, while the sun was still coming up. I'd get in, and then I'd pick a direction and just start walking. And I did not encounter another human being on either of my well, that's not true. I did one day. I saw one park guy driving one of these earth moving things. It had some kind of dragline thing on the back that it's like a gigantic weed whacker that you hitch to the back of a vehicle, and it just churns up all of the vines along the side of the road. So that's how they keep these trails open. But in general, it was just me by myself, not seeing other people. Oh yeah, and that's right. I did encounter a woman who was there who she apparently goes out every day to visit the swamp. So that was kind of cool. But in general, I just did not see a lot of people. So it was perfect. It's perfect place for introverts. It's perfect isolation, and
you can end up as a bog corpse. That's
Wait, I'm sorry. What?
You could end up as a bog corpse. One of those bodies that.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. If you, yeah. I mean, my mind did occasionally go to serial killers and other things like that. But of course, the other thing is that this is the wildlife there. There are bears, there are bobcats. There were rumors back in the day of panthers. I don't think they have them now. And of course, there were also rumors of alligators. There are not alligators at the present day, but they're coming back because the world is getting warmer, and they have spotted alligators in swamps just a little bit further south in North Carolina. So who knows? In 50 years, there may be alligators in the swamp as well. But in general, yeah, you just walk around. You're like, okay, the vegetation is incredibly dense, so if you get off you can't leave the path in most cases, and there are all these animals around. You look up, there are vultures overhead, kind of checking you out, looking for lunch, and it's just quite an experience. So I got a very good sense in these two long walks of what life might have been like, and enough to describe what I needed to describe. And so that was a worthwhile experience. And I by the way, it's very beautiful. I'm making it sound terrible, but it's really quite gorgeous. And every season is different, I'm told. So because I was there, I missed, there's apparently quite an amazing flower show in early spring. And, but every season has something to recommend it. So if you are in the area, I would certainly recommend, There is one trail that I took the first day with my friend where you can actually drive to Lake Drummond, which is this big shallow lake in the center of the southern end of the swamp. And there's a 6-mile driving trail that you can get to there. And if you bring a kayak, you can go out boating. And then there is a campsite accessible only by water somewhere within the swamp. I didn't go there, but that seemed like it'd be a neat place to spend the night. So.
But it does seem like the name itself would keep it from becoming a tourist thing. So
yeah,
hey, honey, let's go to the Great Dismal Swamp. Still sounds like it's you're going to bury me out there. So it's good, and keeping it a best kept secret sort of place, I guess. But, yeah. But tell me again, as a sort of meta question, when you talk about these two books and the potential for a few more. Do you look at this as potentially the legacy project of your career? Do you think in terms of legacy? Yeah.
I mean, I don't generally think in terms of legacy, just because I mean, until recently, the idea that I was actually going to grow old and die was still hypothetical. I mean, yeah, intellectually you know it, but I think, and
no, you've heard my whole leukemia story. I've gone through that in the last year or two with yeah, looks like I'm going to die at some point. So, I guess I have to reconcile my life towards that idea. So,
yeah, so in my case, I haven't had any scares like that yet, but yes, it's just you as you approach 60, you just realize like the warranty starts wearing out on various body parts, and you reach a point where all of your friends are the same age. One of the things you all do when you're gathered together, you talk about what hurts today. Which when you're young, it just seems like, what is with old people that they're always talking about this stuff? And it's like, well, yeah. So
there's a lot of comfort in it, as it turns out.
Yeah, but it's just an interesting, yeah. So it becomes, so you do start thinking about, and I mean, in the long term, we're all going to be, what's the phrase? In the long term, we're all going to lie in unmarked graves. But sure. If there is something of mine that lasts, this is probably my best shot, and I could see it being almost like like Bram Stoker with Dracula. Everybody knows Dracula, but he wrote a bunch of other horror novels, but that nobody ever reads anymore. With I think the partial exception of The Lair of the White Worm, whatever that was based on, that was made into the Kurt Russell movie. But most of his fiction is just unless you are a Stoker. Oh, I'm sorry, right now.
Although Kurt Russell would be fucking awesome in that movie.
yeah, that would be a very different version of the story, though. But yeah, unless you are a real Stoker fanatic and you track down all the other books, then Dracula was the one that he's most remembered for. And so I guess, if I were being purely strategic, I'm thinking Lovecraft Country, in part because it hit just at the right time in the zeitgeist to sort of, it got the HBO series. And I think that the HBO series in particular is going to inspire a lot of other creators to do really interesting things in this sort of general subgenre. So I may get a footnote out of that, and that footnote will be this one thing I did. And then, Full on the Hill, there'll be a copy of that in the Cornell library, probably, as long as Cornell is around. But yeah, I don't really.
It's a fool's game.
It's not something. Yeah, it's a fool's game, and unfortunately, it's like it would be more interesting if I honestly believed I was going to be around in some sense to watch. Yeah. If I could attend my own funeral and then watch the aftermath of my own life, I would be much more intrigued by this stuff. But there's a sense when it's over, unless I have a big surprise in store for me, I just I don't think it's going to matter to me one way or another. Sure. So. Yeah.
That's I'd say a healthy outlook at the unhealthy outcomes we all have awaiting us. But that gets to the question, what are you watching as opposed to who are you reading? Although if you are reading anything, you could tell me that too.
What I have been, lately we've been, let's see.
I know you've been doing the Lovecraft adaptations and variants on your blog, but I assume there's a lot more than that going on.
I've been going back and rewatching, and people who want to go to my blog or to my website, which is bymatttruff.com, and if you look in the blog, I've just been doing this what I call the Lovecraft binge watch, where I write about horror films and horror series that in some way are either inspired by the Lovecraft canon or sort of thematically fit with it. And it's just a way basically of reviewing some cool horror things that I had seen over the years that stuck with me. And the most recent one was about Archive 81, which is a sadly aborted HBO Netflix series about a guy who works for the Museum of the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, and he's hired. He's an archivist and basically a guy who restores videotapes. So he's paid $100,000 to restore this set of fire damaged videotapes from there was this building called the Visser Apartments that mysteriously went up in flames in 1994, and one of the occupants was a woman named Melody Pendress, who was a cultural anthropology student who was doing an oral history of the building. And so some shady rich guy got a hold of these tapes, and he wants them restored and digitized because he believes it will offer information about maybe what caused the fire and what really went on there. And of course, he's got a secret agenda. And part of the deal that's kind of fishy is that, he says these tapes are too fragile to be moved, which as soon as you see them seems like a weird thing to say. They're just little cassette tapes, and it's like, why would those be too fragile to move? Just put them in a box and don't drop it.
Right.
But anyway, so to do the work, the archivist has to go to this remote research compound in upstate New York in the Catskills, and there's no internet, there's no good cell service, but the landline makes kind of funny clicking noises whenever the guy makes a call, and there's cameras throughout the building, and there's not supposed to be anybody else on the property, but it very quickly becomes apparent that there is somebody else there. And so basically that there's the real mystery has something to do with this apartment building being built on the site of a mansion that was also destroyed by fire and that belonged to this society called the Voss Society that was into demon worship. So it's, so it's an interesting and creepy story, and but in the first season is very compelling and very good, and Netflix ended up canceling it. So it kind of resolves, but kind of doesn't. But I still think it's very good and worth watching. So that was my most recent thing. And then things I haven't written about, like a lot of people, my wife and I have started watching The Last of Us on HBO, which is the latest zombie apocalypse. My wife is very much not a zombie apocalypse type of person, but
she married
that,
into
she's
it.
really enjoying this. Okay. Yeah. But she's really enjoying it, and the storytelling is just really top notch. They've done some amazing things. So even if you're not a zombie person, like particularly people were kind of losing their minds over the third episode, which sort of tells a self-contained story about two survivors of the zombie pandemic, and it's the kind of thing, even if you don't want to watch the whole series, you can just put on that episode. And it starts with the two main characters who are making a cross-country trip, and very quickly switches over to this sort of backstory of these two men who end up living together in this isolated compound and tells their story of their life together. It's amazing. So, I'm about to start rewatching the HBO series Lovecraft Country, because I'm doing my own podcast with a friend of mine, Blake Collier, to do with The Destroyer of Worlds. And one episode, we're just going to talk about the adaptation and, our thoughts about that, and the interesting, my interesting thoughts about the differences between the book and the series. So I'm kind of looking forward to that, but I've got to remind myself, it's been a while since I've watched the show, so
sure.
I want to look at that again. So
I couldn't forgive them for George. That was it. Just killed me. But it's okay. I understand. Different creative direction. Blah blah blah. But
Courtney B. Vance, shouldn't ask for more money. That's what happens.
Oh man. And that's the sort of thing I didn't want to ask. But what aspects of
Yeah. No. That by the way, that is a joke. They just I don't know why they chose to kill George off so soon, but it was just but part of it is just Misha, God bless her, she's just a lot more bloodthirsty than I am, and I do think part of it was she had this plan going forward that was going to keep with the idea of this recurring cast of Black characters, and more generally people of color, characters you don't, historically see very often at the center of supernatural storylines. But I think part of the reason she was so ruthless is I think she wanted to stick to the cast members that she saw as wanting to do something with. So, and I guess her vision just didn't include as much. She was more interested in the women, and I was fine with that. It's like, so most of the male members of the cast don't make it through the first season, and that was an interesting setup for whatever she was going to do next. So, and I think that's a perfectly valid choice. But So this is one thing I'm sure we'll discuss on my own podcast, is just those decisions and why I did things the way I did, and why I maybe think why Misha was doing things her way. And so that'll be an interesting discussion.
Can't wait to listen to those too. Any chance of having her appear on your show? Or is that against the purpose of what you're trying to do with yours? So.
Part of it is it's not that I have anything negative to say. It's just I kind of want to. It's more about my thoughts. Misha's busy, She's
I figure that there's a whole lot of reasons she would not be, but yeah.
Yeah. Again, that thing about not wanting the teacher in the room with you looking over your shoulder while you're trying to talk. It's like I would just feel very self-conscious, and that would be an interesting discussion to have. Certainly, to talk to her directly about why did you make certain decisions. But I think that's a different podcast. And again, there is the thing too that because I was never that closely involved in the show, I made a couple of visits. We had a very cordial relationship, but I never really got that close to Misha where I feel like I could just call her up and say, "Hey, want to come hang out on the podcast with me?"
Trust me, it's a real difficult question to ask anybody. I've found, but with enough practice, I can pretty much pitch anyone on the show. But I kid.
Same thing with with Jordan Peele, where I'm grateful to him for making the series possible, because it really was his decision to option the book that made any of the rest of it happen, because the success of Get Out basically allowed him to do whatever he wanted next. I just happened to get lucky to be part of that golden ticket, but. And, Jordan and I had one wonderful phone conversation. I've exchanged a couple of emails with him over the years since, but the idea that, he and I did not become buddies, and it's more's the pity, because he's a really interesting guy, and I would love to work with him again. But until and unless I someday end up on an actual film project where we're collaborating, like if I wrote a screenplay and pitched it to him, it's not like I can just call him up and say, "Hey, you want to come hang out?" I would just feel really self-conscious about that, because I don't, it's not that tight a relationship. We respect each other, I think, as peers, but from a great distance. And that's just the way it works. And the other thing is too, Misha and Jordan both, I think they just work a lot harder than I do. I'm very much, one project at a time, and there are multiple irons in the fire. They're busy people. So there's that too. So
there's those runs where Peele, Waititi, all these people had like 8 different projects that seem to be TV and movies going on simultaneously. I'm like, I'm sure they've got staff and offices that help handle this stuff, but I understand the striking while the iron is hot mentality. Yeah. All of that said, now that the book is out, I can ask, next project? Are you already at work on book 3, or are you in the? I haven't
started writing it yet.
Okay.
I think I need a little time to just think it over. I know what it's about, and I know kind of where it's going, but I'm still figuring out. Like, I'm not at the point where I'm ready to start writing yet. I'm still sort of assembling. There's big pieces of the puzzle that are still missing, but in general terms, there is a plot point within Destroyer of Worlds where Horus and his mother are inside this wizard's house, and Horus grabs this silver key, and takes it with him, and that you don't really learn what that is and what it does. You get the impression that it has something to do with dreams, but I don't really go into detail about what it can do and what it's about. But H.P. Lovecraft fans will recognize the Silver Key as being a part of the Randolph Carter stories, and it's something to do with the keys to the world of dreams. So the next book will be, in the way that this one is about death, the next one will be about dream and desire and young romance. So, and part of it will be it'll be my exploration of my version of the Lovecraftian dreamlands. So.
I look forward to you spending 3 or 4 years on it, and my spending like 3 or 4 hours just devouring it.
Yeah, there you go. But that's totally fine. Yeah,
it's a lot better than I got about halfway through and never finished it. Like that. That's just not a possibility with your prose. So
exactly, better that than the reverse, where I spend like a minimal amount of time banging it out, and then you spend 4 years trying to get finished because you're just so bored. So
not so much. But next time around, and any time in between, I hope you and I get to sit down together. I hope I get out to Seattle at some point, or, if you're going to be in New York, New Jersey region, we could sit down and do another face-to-face.
And definitely. Yeah. Let me know if you're going to be this way. Cause I'd love to see you, and it's always a pleasure to chat. So.
And that was Matt Ruff. His fantastic new book is The Destroyer of Worlds, A Return to Lovecraft Country. If you haven't read the first book, you can read this one without, but you really are missing out, because Lovecraft Country is a wonderful novel and a very different one, as we talked about in terms of structure and everything, than Destroyer of Worlds. Anyway, go check it out. In fact, go check out Matt's site, bymattruff.com, which is BYMATTRUFF.com, and you'll see much more about his work, his blog, which has some very funny entries in it, and, an awful lot more, including the podcasts that he was talking about, including the new one that's going to be launching very shortly about the Lovecraft Country TV series. Anyway, his Twitter feed is also by Matt Ruff, all one word. And Matt, as I hope I got across, is one of my favorite contemporary writers, and even if I do, devour his books way too quickly, but this one really is a treasure, and I'm really looking forward to how he expands that world and continues his character's story against the backdrop of America in the 50s and 60s. And I really think if he pulls off what he's hoping to write, it's going to be something lasting, Anyway, you can support the Virtual Memories podcast by telling other people about it. Let them know there's a show that comes out every week with interesting conversation with fascinating people. And also, you can help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, and who you think I should record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or art exhibition or theater you think I should turn listeners onto. You can do that by sending me postcards. I love postcards. Email, direct message if we're connected on Twitter or Instagram or something, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you're going to go longer than that, just call back and leave a second message and I'll figure it out. Also, let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to say that I'd love to share with listeners, but at the same time, I would never do that without the permission of the speaker. So let me know. If you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. Go subscribe to my Substack, but just do the free tier because I haven't done any paywall stuff yet. But what you can do is support individuals and institutions in need. You can find individuals through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, and other crowdfunding platforms, where you'll find people who need help with just making the rent, covering medical bills, getting an artistic project off the ground, and other stuff. When it comes to institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank every month. I make targeted election contributions. I give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, and Women's Choice Funds, and other sorts of, other funds that are out there that'll help try to build a better world. So I hope you'll do the same. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.